It was late in the evening when we got a dispatch call to a local residence. My partner and I were patrolling a local neighborhood in our vehicle, and since we were in the vicinity, we accepted the call. It had been a hang-up call, according to the dispatcher, but protocol designated we still check it out. When we got to the house, I immediately felt as though something was off. All of the lights in the residence were out, no curtains had been drawn, and the windows peered at us like vacant eyes in the dark. At this point, my partner thought the call just might have been a prank pulled by some of the local kids, but we couldn't leave until we were certain there was no emergency. And, like I said, something about the place made me feel uneasy. We switched on our flashlights and shone them toward the house. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed movement in one of the upper windows when the beam glanced off it, but there was nothing there when I checked again. Either I had imagined it, or the house wasn't empty after all. I alerted my partner to act with caution, not quite telling her what I had seen, but we both approached the house. We went to the front door first. The porch light was broken and strung with thick cobwebs, and the paint on the wood was peeling. Some of it flaked off the door when I knocked, each thud echoing dully inside. After a few minutes of waiting and receiving no answer, I tried again. "The windows?" my partner suggested when we were met with further silence, and I nodded. Since the windows were uncovered, we were able to shine the flashlight right into the room. The first window revealed a kitchen. Even from the outside, I could see the plates of old food stacked in the sink and the flies buzzing around the trash. Layers of grime coated the surfaces, and there were puddles of spilt liquid on the floor. I could almost smell it just from looking at it. The place must not have been cleaned for months. I glanced at my partner, and she looked equally disgusted. "Let's check the other window," I suggested, and we both crossed to the other side of the property. I already had an idea of what we would find. A kitchen in a state like that usually meant the owner had passed on or passed away. Sure enough, the moment we shone our flashlights into the room, my partner recoiled. There was a body in the middle of the room. It was difficult to see every little detail. The window was considerably dirtier than the other, with yellow stains and a kind of sticker residue obscuring parts of the glass, but I saw enough to figure out that the person had been dead a long time. "Get someone over here to take the body. I'm going to go inside. Someone must have made that 911 call." I left my partner to make the call, and I went back to the front door, trying the handle. It was locked, but the door was old and rotted enough that it was easy to break the whole thing down with a few shoulder rams. As soon as the door was open, a wave of putrid-smelling air washed over me, and I fought back the urge to gag. Wishing I had some vapor rub to block the smell, I tentatively stepped inside, flashing the beam of my torch over the hallway. It didn't look like anyone had passed through here in months. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor and no fresh footprints. Whoever had made that call must have come in another way. Seeing no sign of anybody else here, I went into the living room where the body was. The smell was even stronger, decay and rot. From where I was stood, I couldn't see any obvious causes of death, but that was for the coroner to find out. I was only here to investigate, and what bothered me the most was who had made the original call. Someone must have discovered the deceased person and called it in, but dispatch was sure the phone call had come from inside the house itself. The number was a landline. Backing out of the room, I went in search of a phone, listening out for any signs of an intruder as I went. All was quiet, but I did find a landline. It was on the counter in the hallway, off the hook. There were no fingerprints in the dust, but I still picked up the receiver with my sleeve, holding it away from my ear so as to not contaminate the surface. There was no dial tone. I tried punching in a number on the dial pad, but still nothing happened. The phone was dead. That struck me as odd. Unless there was another phone somewhere in the house, how had the call been made? Stranger still, it turned out that all of the utilities in the house had been shut off when the resident stopped paying the bills. Nothing worked, and nor had it worked for a long time. The landline had no way of operating, and yet somehow it had been used to place a call to the police. We searched the residence top to bottom, and we found nothing. There was no evidence of an intruder, and no other phone was discovered. We never did find out who had made that 911 call, and it still unsettles me, even to this day. One evening, me and my partner were on patrol when we received a call from dispatch that there were complaints of loud noises coming from a field near some homes. We were the closest car to the scene, and we radioed in that we would check it out. This, in our opinion, was going to be a quick response where the person or persons would run at the sight of the car. At worst, it was probably some teens having a little fun, and we might have to break up a bit of underage drinking, so basically a nothing calls. My partner pulled the car next to the curb, and I got out and took my first look at the field in which the noises were apparently coming from. It struck me as odd that there wasn't a light on anywhere out there. If people were out there, you would think that they would have something allowing them to see. Instead, though, the only light came from the street lights, which only allowed you to see maybe 10 feet in. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam cut a path through the void, but revealed nothing. I started to get a bad feeling about being here, but we still had to look through the field to put the homeowners at ease. The ground was covered with dead weeds and grass that snapped and crackled with every step. I wanted to be quiet so as to not alert someone to our presence, but that seemingly being impossible only ramped up the anxiety that pressed against the inside of my ribcage. This seemingly innocuous check of a field didn't feel as harmless as I had initially thought. Radio traffic comes through the mic on my chest. With the tension I was feeling, I nearly jumped at the noise. It was dispatch asking if we had found anything in the field. "Nope, nothing yet, still searching." What is it they claim they heard? I figured someone had been running around causing a general ruckus like kids and teens are known to do. When the man came back and told me that numerous homes had complained of blood-curdling screams coming from the area we were in. This was a detail I would have preferred to have known before now. If there was a possibility someone could be hurt or worse, I would have gotten here quicker and maybe asked for another unit to help in the search. I silently cursed myself for not asking more questions before responding to the call. With the knowledge that someone could be hurt out here and maybe the possibility of violence, I draw my sidearm. I see out of the corner of my eye that my partner has already done the same. I hold the light with one hand and my gun in the other to alert to the possibility of danger now. I swore I could feel eyes on me somewhere in the darkness. I've never felt like I was being stalked by someone before while doing this job until that night. We were out in the open, exposed, perfect prey for someone who was lying in wait. Acting on our training, the two of us spread out, close enough to see the other, but far enough that someone couldn't get the drop on both of us. I tried to mimic the speed of his footsteps so we could hear any irregularities that could give us an idea that someone was approaching. I was looking for any advantage I could get at this point. A crack that sounded like a stick breaking shot out in front of us. I could only make out a general direction and aim the light towards my best guess of where it was. The rapid motion of the lights caused the shadows of the dead vegetation to dance, giving the illusion of movement. Thinking we were seeing something out there only increased the speed at which we darted the flashlights back and forth, making the effect worse. You would have almost thought we had been surrounded from the way we began spinning in slow circles, trying to follow the tricks that our eyes were playing on us. I felt like I had foolishly walked into a trap, ignorant of the dangers that lie in the field. I felt a drip of sweat slowly trail down my forehead into my eye. The salty fluid burns, blurring my vision and forcing me to blink rapidly, trying to ease the discomfort. I hated doing it because it broke my concentration for a moment. The wrong moment, as it turned out. From somewhere in the darkness, a scream pierced the night. It was a woman's scream, one only someone in great pain and anguish would be capable of making. My first thought was someone was dying. Conflicting thoughts rush into my brain like a tidal wave. Should I go out there and risk my own life, or should I call for backup and wait? The woman's shriek resounds once more, making the decision for me. I race into the darkness. The bouncing beam of the flashlight keeps it from being a complete blind charge into the abyss. However, I don't see the rock right in front of me, and I tripped over it and sprawl face first into the dirt. My first thought is that whatever was out here with us has tripped me up. I spin on my back and point my gun at the space between my feet. It takes a moment to register the stone that I have ripped out of the dry earth and realize what has actually happened. I know I have to get up, that I'm vulnerable on the ground. Hurry up, get to your feet! I put one hand on the ground and swing myself upright. I attempt to look back and forth, but am unable to see more than a few feet in front of me. I walk over and pick up the flashlight that I have dropped on the ground. Luckily, I didn't discharge my firearm when I fell, which had been in my hand. A short distance away, I hear my partner's voice. "You okay over there?" More embarrassed by the careless fall, I tell him that I am, and for us to find the woman so we can get the hell out of there. We spend the next 10 minutes walking a grid pattern in the field, but come up empty-handed. The dark has made it impossible to conduct a proper search, and the flashlights just aren't going to cut it. We decide to walk back to the car and let the station know what has happened. On the way there, neither one of us seems comfortable with what has gone on while we were in the field. We know we had heard the woman scream, and to leave someone there felt wrong. We had done a thorough search of the area for the equipment we had and come up with nothing, but if someone was in trouble, then we needed to find them. We decided we would take the spotlight on the car and pass it over the area. It was flat, so we assumed it would give us a better view. At least now we had a plan of action, which felt better than just leaving. I unlocked the doors and was about to climb in when the scream came once again. Not wanting to miss my chance, I took hold of the light and passed it back and forth over the vacant lot. From my vantage, I had a commanding view of the area, which appeared empty. I passed slowly back and forth, but it revealed the same thing. I looked at my partner, silently asking him if he had seen something I had missed. He gave me a single shake of his head, telling me he hadn't. I was starting to get a little weirded out by the whole place. The bad feeling I had when I first got here had settled itself like a stone in the pit of my stomach. I got out, leaving the spot on the area, and stared unsure of what to do next. I wanted my partner's opinion, so what do we do? I was cut off mid-sentence by a sound like a giant piece of wood falling in the middle of the field. I spun around, trying to find what or where it had come from. The light was still on, but nothing seemed to have changed. It was like these noises, the woman's screams, and now the falling wood, had no source. When I see his pupils and the slight tremor of his body, I don't need to ask what he thinks we should do next. He is scared right now and has no interest in pursuing this any further. I am of the mind to agree with him. I turn the keys in the ignition and put the car into gear. As we pull away from the lot, I radio into dispatch that we didn't find anything suspicious in the field. If I would have told them what really happened, I would have been put on leave until they had an evaluation done on the two of us. I figured the lie was the better choice. If you think that is the last thing that happened, though, you'd be wrong. Needing to take a break after dealing with that field, we pulled into a gas station to grab a couple of drinks for the road and really just catch our breath. When I walked around the back of the car, I could see in the dust on the trunk what looked like someone had dragged their fingers through the dust. I know that the car had been washed that day, and neither one of us had touched that trunk. I had no way of explaining how they got there. I don't know what was in the field with the two of us that night. I thought about going back there the next day and looking around to see if I could find something when it was light out, but I couldn't bring myself to drive there. Every time I tried to bring myself to do it, I just kept hearing in my head not to. It felt like I would be tempting fate to do so. As a police officer, we're trained to deal with the worst elements of society, to run into dangerous situations when others are running away. But that is when other people are involved. What are you supposed to do when something happens like what happened in that field? I guess everyone has to make that decision for themselves. My partner and I were working an afternoon shift when dispatch got in touch with the local call-out. The residence in question was familiar to us. They were something of a frequent flyer, and we'd been called out to them several times in the past for almost every complaint in the book. Thinking it ought to be a quick visit to smooth out the issue, my partner and I took the call and set off. This time, they were complaining of severe back pain. The caller was an older woman who lived on her own in an apartment block. We had been there enough times that I already knew which flat belonged to her without having to check with dispatch. She answered the door almost as soon as we knocked, her shoulders hunched forward and a grimace on her face. I could tell she wasn't putting anything on. She seemed genuinely crippled with the pain. We helped her into her chair and had her tell us what was wrong.
"I've had horrible pain in my back for months," she told us, her features twisting into a grimace every time she shifted in the chair. "Some days it's so bad I can't get out of bed."
"Have you seen a doctor about it?" She shook her head, twisting her neck to look around the room before leaning forward slightly.
"The people in my room told me not to call anyone," she said with an almost secretive urgency. "They told me not to get any help."
At this point, I couldn't help but look around, too. The state of her apartment was relatively tidy, and there was no evidence that anyone else but herself lived there. From what I knew, she had always been alone.
"They can see you," she continued, staring right at me.
Her words instantly unnerved me, and when I asked who she was talking about, she gestured vaguely to the corner of the room.
"Them. They're watching you. They don't like you because you're helping me. They didn't want me to call you."
I didn't quite understand what she was alluding to, but I figured at this point she needed to be checked over at the hospital. "Well, it's a good job you did call," I continued, fighting the urge to turn around and look into the corner of the room she was staring at. I knew there was nobody there. I would have seen them when we came in. "Let's get you to the hospital so you can be checked over properly." As I helped her out of her chair, I asked my captain if he could investigate the rest of the apartment and make sure there was nobody else there. The woman seemed adamant that she was not alone, and it alarmed me to think that she might be harassed by someone, especially if they had told her not to seek any help. As I helped the woman get her things together, my captain checked over the whole apartment, but he couldn't find any trace of anyone but the woman living there. There was nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary, and a neighbor even confirmed that she had seen nobody else go into the residence. There was little else we could do about the matter, so we left the apartment and secured the woman into the back of the ambulance. Her vitals seemed steady, and she told us that her pain wasn't too severe at the moment, so we started towards the hospital. I stayed in the back, keeping an eye on her to make sure her pain didn't worsen. During the transport, I noticed she seemed agitated by something. She kept glancing around the ambulance with little, darting movements, but every now and then, her eyes would come to rest on the empty seat beside her, and she would let out a disheartening sigh.
"Are you okay? That really does look terrible," she said suddenly, still facing the empty seat. "What happened to you?"
She waited a beat, her features softening, and then said softly,
"I'm very sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you aren't in pain anymore."
Before I could ask who she was talking to, she turned to face me and whispered,
"He's a bit scary looking."
I looked towards the seat she had been staring at, feeling a sudden chill through my neck. There was nobody there. But earlier that day, the seat had been occupied by a badly disfigured trauma victim. One of our first dispatches that morning had been to a car versus semi-trauma code, the outcome of which had been sorely gruesome and tragic. It must have been a coincidence that drew the woman's attention to the seat, but I couldn't deny it put me on edge for the rest of the journey. There was clearly something affecting the woman's sense of reality if she was seeing people who weren't there. When we reached the hospital, we handed the patient over to the doctors and headed off to our next dispatch, but I still couldn't take my mind completely off what the woman had told us about the people in her apartment or the man in the ambulance. I could have been overthinking things, but something about it just seemed odd and a little eerie, especially the connection to the trauma victim who had occupied that very seat. It wasn't until the following morning that I found out the woman had passed away in the night. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer, far too late to be operated on, but the doctors assured me she hadn't been in any pain. It's one of those cases that I just can't forget, even years later. To this day, I still wonder what the woman had seen in her final hours. Who was the scary-looking man who had been with us in the back of the ambulance? Who were the people in her apartment? It's unlikely I'd ever get to find out.
For more 911 True Ghost Encounters and scary stories on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe.